We've hit time. I'm sure by the sounds of things outside, people are going to probably scuttle around. For those that are joining remotely, you can't jump in here, but I've always wanted to do this. So I'm going to do a selfie with everybody here. You can all do like crazy poses or whatever. But yeah, this is like a pretty cool moment. So you can all do like some cool, I don't know, you can do gang signs if you want. Thanks. Great. So what I'm going to do is have Slack running over here. So if there's questions, I'll jump in. Today what we're going to be doing is talking about building a learning culture. This seemed very boring initially, so I spoke to marketing and I was like, is this a really good way of like bringing people into the talk? And they're like, no, let's use clickbait. So let's make it, why are you not learning more at work? And so that was the talk that was put on the outside. So hopefully that works and a lot of people come and join the talk. A little bit about me. My name is Ruberto. I am currently the head of engineering at Peach Payments, and I have been since December 2020. What a ride. Our team has grown exponentially during that time, and been very, very cool to be a part of that. So we grew 500% in 1 year, and that sounds a bit crazy, but in order for us to get to that stage, there's a lot of things that we've had to build into the company to help us like scale like that. And so one of the tools is this learning framework. So expectations, what can you expect to leave here with? I really want you guys to be able to have something that you can take away and say, I want to try this where I work, and then be able to see if it works. So there's going to be like a legit thing, right? When we talk about learning culture, I want it to have a very similar mindset when we talk about like a DevOps culture or a QA culture. You know, it's to change the way that we work. And so a little bit about Peach. We are a seamless payment gateway in South Africa. So we support a wide variety of different plugins for e-commerce stores. We have really, really big merchants. I can guarantee if anybody's bought anything online, you've probably used Peach unknowing it. So we have some really, really, really great merchants, and we manage a lot of volume. So it's very cool to be able to represent Peach. And this is also a soft launch of our new branding. So we're changing. We're going to have brand new sites and everything, a whole new suite of applications. But today, what are we going to be talking about? What can you expect? So we're going to talk a little bit about why learning matters. And in each of these sections, we're going to have takeaways. And then at the end, we're going to review those takeaways. And that, with the framework, will help you figure out how to learn quite rapidly at work. So why does learning matter? Defining what we mean when we talk about culture, the different types of learning, resistance to learning, and then the actual framework itself. But before we get any further, let's talk about a frame of reference. This is going to be super important. It's going to be something that carries all the way through the rest of the talk. So if I was to ask you all, you know, how fast are you currently moving? You might say, well, I'm sitting down right now, so probably nowhere. Maybe I'm moving really fast because my heart's going really quick. But if you had to like look in relation to something else, we're moving at about, 1,500 kilometers per hour. That's how fast the Earth is spinning at any one point, and it takes 24 hours for us to get to rotation. So in terms of just taking a step back and thinking about our frame of reference, which is a physics type of thing, but this also translates into what we're going to be talking about today. So for each of us, we have a different standpoint where we're looking at learning. If we had to look at how fast we're moving around the sun, it's really fast, 107,000. That's going to give you a speeding ticket for real. It takes 365 days to go around that. But if you had to look at like how fast we're currently moving, we're there in the Milky Way. This is a 3D rendering. Obviously, we don't have like a giant selfie stick that can take pictures like this. But in the Milky Way, our solar system is moving almost 1 million kilometers an hour. That's wild. And it takes us about 230 million years to do one rotation of the Milky Way galaxy. But this is where it gets really interesting, right? So how fast are we currently moving? We're actually moving at around 600 kilometers per second. And this is in references to the extragalactic frames of reference. If you want to go down a minefield of YouTube videos, Google that, watch YouTube videos, and for the rest, you're going to feel real silly. But this is super interesting. Another point of reference, if you had to shoot a bullet, how fast is that? It's about 0.9 kilometers per second. So we're moving at an incredible pace through the space. And so some companies are going to be like that. Some companies are going to provide you with learning that you feel like you're moving 600 kilometers per second. In other places, after a little while, you're going to be feeling like you're just sitting watching the sunset. So very, very important thing as we go through this, think about where you kind of sit within your company. All right, so let's get into it. Why does learning matter? A lot of what I'm going to go through here, as Robert McLean said in the beginning, I Googled a lot of this. So you can too. I've also put all the references at the bottom, so you'll be able to see what those are. But, so when we talk about learning, we have a high degree of monotony as a species, and I never knew what that word was until when I was preparing for this talk, but what monotony means is that we are kind of leaning towards being juvenile as a species, right? We're kind of childish. Even as an old person might push their kids into the pool, right? You have a lot of fun, and monotony is tied very closely with learning. So if you're quite young at heart, and you're more likely to learn as a species. And so, as we've evolved throughout the millions of years, we've sort of developed this trait, and it's a survival trait. So it actually feels wrong to our very core if you're at a place and you're not learning. You can actually feel the stagnation, and it feels awful to be in that place, right? So this is a natural instinct. It's rated the second most important factor in workplace happiness, after the nature of work itself. How important is that? So learning, really, really, really important for us to have happiness at work. And it has even been classified as an economic imperative. So learning is tied very closely to how much money you make. And I think all of us like making lots of money. So if you work really, really hard, you learn quite a lot, you specialize, the ceiling becomes much higher in terms of what you can earn, but also your companies have much higher thresholds to how much they can make. So learning is incredibly important. This is from a really, really good book called Testing Business Ideas by Dr. David J. Bland. And this is sort of the model that we expect when we see agile, right? We build a thing, and then we try and measure that thing, and then we learn. Who sort of practices this? Anybody think that they practice it like this? Okay, I see a couple hands. However, I think it's like that, but maybe we think about like the urgency of work comes in, and it kind of pushes out this luxury of learning, and oftentimes we just get too caught up with this inexorable flow of work. And so what ends up happening is it kind of looks more like that, right? We build all the things, and then we may measure it, and we may not even learn anything at all. And so this is one of the concepts that started creaking in when we're talking about learning-based work cultures. Very few companies actually get this right. And some of them have done like these big bang hackathon type events where we try to make very intentional time frames for people to like learn. But what these big companies are learning is that that's not really effective. What we need to do is actually bring learning into the flow of work. All right, so that's the first big takeaway, right? We need to make sure that learning is a part of the flow of work and not something that's beside it. You can have hackathons, you can have your hour in every Friday morning to read a book. That is not a very good way of learning. All right, so why is learning important? There's a lot there. All right, next, we're going to define culture, and this can be quite tricky. And so just as the frames of reference, I think every single person here is going to have a different definition of what this means. So this is our definition at Peach. Well, Peach Engineering, we've all kind of came together, sat down and said, what does culture mean to us? And this is what we've come up with. And that's beliefs, values, principles, and a social behavior that are practiced by a group of people. Who here work at a company that is less than 10 people in size? Here we've got one person. Between 10 and 100. All right, a few more. Between 100 and 250. All right, and then more than 250. Okay, this is going to be really interesting. All right. All right, going back to space. When you look at like how our planet is sort of dissected, this is Jupiter. There's a lot of hydrogen. There's gaseous hydrogen, liquid hydrogen, metallic hydrogen. So if you're a fan of hydrogen, this is a planet for you. But the other way of looking at this sort of model in psychology is called the iceberg model, but I like looking at it like this, where your emotional component, your beliefs, your values, these are things that you formed since you were a little kid. In fact, most of this stuff comes from when you're between 0 and 7 years old. You kind of solidify a lot of who you are at that stage. Now, from that, you generate a lot of ideas and thoughts. That's the next level. So from your beliefs and your sort of values, that's where your thought patterns come from, and this is what sort of then eventually fuels what you say and what you do. Right? That's a very interesting sort of model. So when we talk about culture, just as you saw on the slide before, we're talking about values and principles of that group that are shared. Changing emotional component of a person is incredibly hard. It takes a huge amount of time, and in fact, in order for you to really see change there, you have to have lived experience. You can't just tell somebody, you need to change that little part about you. It's incredibly difficult. And so what we generally do in businesses is that if we see behavior that you don't like, we try change like what people are saying. You're not allowed saying that, right? It's a very shallow way of addressing a problem. Because we understand that when somebody says something, they've probably formed an idea around that, and that's probably come from some lived experience that they've had before. So it takes a little bit of time in order for you to like instill like a culture at work. Right. This is like probably the worst picture I could have put up here because it's so like really hard to see what's going on here. But this is from eyes.nasa.gov. It's a really cool site. So if you want to go there, they're trying to monitor the solar system. So they have like in real time where all the planets are. They even have one that monitors all the asteroid belt. But when we talk about company culture, I want us to think about that, like the solar system. It's a group of star systems and a group of different things. There's a whole asteroid belt that flows in between it. It's a whole bunch of moving components. In fact, if you had to count at a very juvenile level, we have 8 planets, sorry, Pluto. But if you had to look at it at a very detailed level, we have millions upon millions of like celestial objects floating around us in that vicinity, right? Just like a business, we have these various different departments, but inside there could be many, many, many individuals. So at a company level, when the company is very small, you'll find that cultures will be extremely tight. That the way that you believe, the way that you think, the way that you do things will be highly influenceable between the group of you. But as the company changes size, and some of you may have felt this as companies grow, things start changing. And like, why is that conversation now really, really hard, right? It's very important to define an overarching company goal at a company as a guide, but don't expect anybody to sort of believe those things 100%. So as we go down to a smallest subsystem, this is when you get your department culture, so engineering within your greater company, right? You'll find that this subculture will reflect the greater culture of the company, but it will be unique. They'll have their own way of doing things. Like engineering will have their own way of like escalating problems or talking to one another. That might be very different from how finance does that thing. And so you need to find that like that very subtle differences, but then be able to define a department culture for that group to believe in, that then feeds up into the company culture. And then lastly, you have your team culture. Now this is Tethys, my favorite moon, hashtag Tethys. It's in Saturn. It's a very interesting moon. It doesn't move on a very stable orbit. But these sort of micro subcultures are the most important ones. So when we want to influence how a company works, we go down to the very smallest level, because this is where the tightest cultures will be formed. You'll find that if we just move one person into a team, it completely changes that team's culture, because they've come in with new ideas, new thoughts. And so oftentimes, when we want to change company culture, we go about this the wrong way. We set a company culture at the highest level, and then we expect that like it just sort of trickles everywhere else. When what we should be doing is consulting with all of the smallest little groups and saying, how do we do more of this thing? All right, so the next takeaway is provide the smallest working unit with learning autonomy. All right, so you want to go to each one of those groups and say, we want to have learning as like a key component of how we work. So I want you to figure out how you're going to do that together as this unit. And then whatever you sort of figure out, let us know what you want to do, and you can do that thing. And you'll find that every single team will have their own unique way of doing this. And this is why it's very important. We can't sort of enforce this one big global thing. It's very unlikely that it will work out. All right, let's go into types of learning. This is a very interesting set of thoughts that I've had for a long time. I'm going to give us an example. So my very first job, while I was in high school, I worked at a paint shop, Jack's Paint. It was right across from my high school, and the company paid me to literally pick up heavy paint cans and move them around the shop. And I swear they were just doing it for fun after a while, because they're like, move all the blue paint to that section. Okay, do it. And then they're like, move it back to this section, but arrange it like this. And at the back of the store, they had this paint machine. I don't know if you've ever seen these things. They have these huge cylinders of different color paints. And you stick this paint can underneath, and you type in a computer the different type of pigments you want, and this thing rotates and it squirts the right amounts. You stick it in a shaker, and then it comes out. And the guys in the back of the shop never got to move paint cans. So it was my absolute goal to learn how to use this machine so that I didn't have to move paint cans. But it was very interesting. So eventually I bribed enough people so that I got to the back. They gave me a 1-liter paint can so I wouldn't mess it up. And I did it. And then afterwards, the company started letting me do that more and more. But that whole franchise, Jack's Paint, had no idea that an 18-year-old kid coming out of high school knew how to use one of their paint machines and their paint programs. That was a completely invisible learning that happened to that organization. So a lot of learning that happens in our organizations is just like this. It's invisible. No one really sees that it's happening. And how are you supposed to improve a thing that no one knows is happening, right? So we need to look for the different environments where this sort of invisible learning is happening, and then proactively set goals in that places to start. So here comes a bit of the nerdy bits of this talk. This is from our Slack channel. I pulled a lot of metrics. We, as an organization, since 2016 till now recently, we've sent 2.3 million messages to each other. You see the majority of them have been during lockdown. In fact, you can almost clearly see lockdown. Oh, I think this has a laser pointer. Can you see lockdown happen there? And then whoop, lots of communication. You can also see where Christmas is every year, where very little communication happened. This was very interesting to me, where we sent a lot of messages to each other, right? But then I started diving into it more. Okay, but only 85% of all those messages are direct. So all the red stuff is direct. Only 6% of all communication is public. What? That's crazy, right? So learning is almost between two people. That's what's happening in our organization. But very good news, as you can see, there's definitely a big trend where direct communication is falling down and learning in public spaces is lifting up. But it's very slow. This is indicative of a company growing, but a lot of that needs to happen a lot faster. So helping us think about that more. That 6% represents 139,000 messages. That's what I could actually pull from this. Interesting though, this is where people are reading messages, very different from where they're writing messages. A lot of people are actually reading messages in public channels. Only 6% of messages being sent there, but 24% of people are reading messages there. That's a really good indicator that valuable information is being shared in public channels. All right, so what I did, I went and pulled every single bit of communication that I could see, which is going to be all public stuff and all messages that I've sent. And then it comes in a really crazy JSON blob like this. Don't copy this. This is the worst code ever, but that's my code. I wrote a little script. What the script attempts to do is go through every single one of those messages and try pull out questions. So it's very interesting. I got eventually 118,000 messages. 24,000 or 20.7% of them are questions. 20% of all communication that we send was questions. Very interesting though, if you look at the type of questions, we only had 700 being whys. Why is this happening? What is this? Why is that happening, right? A lot more were whats, a lot more were hows. This kind of led me down a direction that maybe what we're doing isn't very complex by its nature. We're not trying to figure out why this thing is happening, but it's how do we interact with this thing, or how do we do this thing? It's interacting with that that understanding that becomes quite tricky. So you can step it up a little bit. This is called Keras. This is a free open source text analysis grouping tool. It uses TensorFlow internally. So this is what I'm now using to try to classify these questions. My big question that I have is, what is the biggest question that we ask? What is one of the most asked questions? Like, what gets asked super frequently? So what I discovered by going through tens of thousands of messages is that there's sort of two groups of, I don't even know if anybody can read that. I'm going to read them out. It's really bad coloring there. But there's two groups of types of questions that are asked, contextual and then mastery. So in contextual, type of questions I saw was, what do we do? How do we do it? Why is it important? To who? And what are great company goals? And internally, I could break those down into three different subcategories. So we had business logic, like the core of what we're trying to do. There was a lot of stuff around like political nature, like who can I talk to about X, or like, do I have to go through this specific tool to be able to get to X? And then there was a bunch of strategy questions as well. On the mastery side, it was more around like, what are the tools that we use? How familiar am I with those tools? Or am I familiar? How familiar? What are the gaps that I have? What are the unique approaches to the way that we do things here that are not standard? And that last one was very, very apparent, because we use serverless and lambdas and step functions in a way that you don't normally see those things being used. And so inside here, I could break those down as well to tooling, analytical, and system dependency. So there's a lot of things that we are learning in the organization. Another thing to think about is that all learning feels the same. In fact, your brain first gives out serotonin, and you feel super good, dopamine, you're like really, really great about stuff, but then it releases glutamate, and glutamate helps solidify stuff. So learning is the function of rewriting your brain. It's a very hardcore thing, but it all feels the same. So when you go to a new company and they're saying, okay, this is how we do the finance stuff in our company, you're like, wow, that's really cool. Your body kicks off that stuff and it feels the same to learning something like very technical, like this is how you do this like enumeration over this array. You're like, wow, that's really cool, that's really fast. That all feels the same. So oftentimes when you come to a company, first off, you'll feel that your like contextual understanding starts off from like almost nothing. And then you have these big steps of like gaining of knowledge, because you work on a project and you become like the person that knows how to work on that thing. And that corner sort of climbs and climbs and climbs over a period of time. But eventually, once you become like the domain knowledge expert in that space, it will kind of plane out. And the same thing happens with your technical understanding. You may actually have quite a good amount when you first join a company, but you're learning new ways that people are doing things, and that sort of planes out. And when both of those things plane out, that's when you get this feeling of like, I'm not learning here anymore. So this is very important. Sometimes we can think that we're actually pushing ourselves technically and we're becoming better as engineers, when all we're actually doing is picking up domain knowledge of that specific company. So make it very intentional that we distinguish those two things. There's this really cool concept. I want to go through a very good engineer that I follow on Twitter, and if you want to follow her, she's really good. Sarah May. She came up with this. I don't want to say she coined the idea of the understanding gap, but this is sort of the conversation that I was following when she introduced this thing. She said, "Been chewing on the idea suggested by NYC player last night that messy code is not technical debt; it's just the interest. That the debt itself is a gap in understanding." And this is where the statement comes in. And until you address that, you'll continue to accumulate interest in the form of more messy code. And messy code obscures concepts and widens the understanding gap, which leads to even more messy code. And if you try to rewrite that code, it will end up in the same problems in the original. Unless you close that understanding gap, you have to pay off the principal. Taking a messy code base directly to microservices is like moving a credit card debt balance over into a new card with lower interest. You might get cleaner code for a while, but you actually haven't fixed the problem. This concept of the understanding gap is so big, because you'll find that you have stakeholders in your company giving you ideas of what you need to build, but they may only give you a partial view of that. And if you just build the thing that you're hearing, you're going to maybe be creating this big gap. And everyone knows that sometimes you'll get this like new request to build a thing, and you're like, that fundamentally changes the way that this app is built. We're going to have to like hack things in here now. So breaking that down is really, really important. Sorry, I'm going to read what it says here. So the third one is discover what understanding gaps are within your organization. Really important. All right, there's a disclaimer here, and this is just a disclaimer on the feeling of growth. And sometimes that feeling of growth can be skewed by motivation. So some of us may be like highly motivated to do a thing, and we're really excited about it because we're like also got lots of competence in that thing. We're like, I can crush that. And other times you may be like, I have less of an understanding of how to do this thing, but I'm interested in learning. That's also another way of doing it. But you also may be a really skilled person, and you're like, I don't want to touch compliance with a mile away, and they give you a compliance training, and you're like, I'm going to purposefully do this for longer. And so you maybe have low motivation on it, even though you could have a really good competence on that thing. So sometimes when you have low motivations, that could also dull the feeling of learning. All right, so let's talk about resistance. There's a really cool image. It's from a study. When you get the URL, you can go and read up the study. So this was taken with a super slow motion camera, and it's a bullet going through just normal air, even though it looks like it's passing through, I don't know, like a material or something. And so it's very easy for us to like walk around and feel very little resistance. But whoever's stuck their hand out a window and you feel like, whoa, it's moving much faster now. A bullet moving through air at full speed feels like you're walking through cheese. It's like incredibly dense, and it slows down really, really quickly. And just like a bullet with really good positive momentum, with just like everything around it being a resistance, learning also has resistance. One of the big things that slows down learning is complexity. So if you have really, really complex systems and things are purposely made complex because it's fun to write complex code and lots of meta stuff, and you shove that all in, that can actually slow down learning for people that are coming in. Like, why is this here? I have to follow into this. Or this was included, this module, but that's like all meta-programmed. It can take you like 6 minutes to like try to trace how this thing is being built. Just because it was fun to do it and it's following like new ideas, it could create a lot of complexity. So one of the things that we motioned for at a company that I work for was reduce complexity as much as possible. Even if there was lots of code duplication, if it was easy to follow what was going on, that's the first win. So simplicity above everything. The next one is obscurity. So this could be things that are really well defined, but just imagine trying to search for the word moose in a dictionary that's not in order. You're going to have to go through every single page to try to find moose, and it's going to take you, maybe you might be lucky, you might be on page 2, but it might be at the very back of the line, and you have to like really look at what's going on. So if you have like a lot of documentation and it seems really great, but it is like everywhere. We have some pages on this tool over here, and some of it lives in Confluence, and other bits live in Google Drive, and some of it lives on Pete's computer. That becomes like really hard to be able to dive through and learn things. Lack of support or resources / people. This is also a really big thing. Sometimes we build a dependency on certain people. If they leave, then we need to like learn really quickly on those things. And they may have like very unique experiences with that. We may not have the books or the courses or the things that you need to learn. Lack of consistency. This is a really big one, and one that we had to challenge ourselves with, because at Peach, when we initially started doing a lot of rewrites, even though everything was Python in some places, it was a very different kind of Python. And so that made it really hard for us to like figure out, okay, if this is how this works, why is that one super different? And now which one do I use? Imposter syndrome. I think everybody probably goes through this at some point. But imposter syndrome is a massive thing that impacts learning. It makes you feel like you're not worthy of doing the things that you're being tasked to do, and that can drive you from learning. So the big things that we can take away from this section is reduce that learning friction as much as possible. Simplify, clarify, standardize, and then give lots of praise. Tell people that they're doing a good job. You'll be surprised that just telling people that, man, you've learned so much of the last little bit, and acknowledge like what they've done. I think at Peach we've had a huge number of our staff have to pick up the tech stack from ground zero. Like coming from, we have .NET, we have Haskell, we have Rust, we have Java, Vue, it's like a huge group of people all coming from different places now writing Python lambdas and React views. So a lot of people are picking up new stuff. Praise them for what they're doing, learning. All right, so now we're going to get into the meaty stuff, the actual learning framework. So how do we measure this sort of learning across the organization? There's these 4 things. Sorry, it doesn't make a cool acronym, so it won't stick around for a lot. But it's really important that you follow these things and in a very specific order. So first you start with definition. So when we say learning is a part of our culture, what does that mean to us, right? We have to set a goal. What does good or success look like when we're talking about this cultural point? Then we set up measurements. So these are the things that how do we know that we're going in the right path, right? We're going to dive into like examples in here. And then the last one is questions. So when we can't tell whether we're learning through these measures, how do we coax that out from the organization? So as an example, so I wouldn't say that you need to cut this and paste this. This would be an example for the organization that I work in with finance. So our definition here might be like, for us, learning could be an increase in understanding within the finance industry and a technical mastery to manage our products. Really cool definition. That's what learning means for us. A goal here could be that new engineers are able to meaningfully contribute within 3 weeks, and that engineers have been here for longer than 3 years are still recording growth. That would be a really cool goal to have. And then measures, there's usually a lot of these things. And we task certain individuals in our team to start looking out for these. So you sit in your stand-ups or your grooming sessions or whatever, and they're looking for these like key behaviors within that group. So engineers are comfortable answering questions regarding business operations. That would be a really good understanding that people are learning things. Or engineers are making sound changes to legacy systems because they've figured it out. We usually have like 2 or 3 dozen measures per our framework. When we get into questions now, I'm going to refer to this book. It is an amazing book if you haven't read it. It's called The Book Beautiful Questions by Warren Berger. I listened to the whole of this book. I got it as an Audible. It's quite long. It's like 7 hours. But I was like, oh, I should listen to it again and write down all the questions. So I started doing that, and I'm like, there has to be an easier way, and then I found out that he had actually done that. So if you don't want to read the whole book, you can go to his website, and there has like a cheat, and it's a great resource to have. So inside here, he's got a ton of different questions, like why are questions important, questions for decision-making, questions about strategy, questions that you need to ask your boss, questions for the business. Really, really powerful. So what I'm going to do now is I've broken down learning into a few different categories, and as I go through these questions, write down some of them, or take notes. Say like, oh, this would be like super interesting to know. I'm going to make these slides available, but think about these questions and say that would be really cool to know in my company, right? So, like quality of the message that's being sent. So, like, what is being said? How much detail is given? How digestible is this information to the new folks? What do you believe in? What are you trying to achieve? And does everybody in the org know what the most important 3 things are? And if not, why don't they know those things? It's a really great exercise to do in one-on-ones that I do is say, what's the most important thing that we're trying to do right now as an organization? And seeing if people know what that is. The next one is the state of communication, which is different from quality of the message. And this is how frequently are questions being asked and who are asking those questions. As I went through that data, I found that some of our most newest engineers that are quite senior were asking upwards of 1,000 questions a month, where some of our more junior engineers were only asking in order of about 100. And you can clearly see a distinction in like where they were fitting in that group. How comfortable is the team with feedback? How often is feedback given? Can teams communicate outside their domain? How much bureaucracy lives between teams? Do you need to go through individuals or tools to communicate? I think I might be the only person that's put this picture up, and I think everyone might know what it is, but this is from data engineering. And so it's a picture of a plane where bullet holes were recorded in Second World War, and they would keep coming back, and they were like, maybe we should like patch these bullet holes so that planes, that's where they're getting shot. And the data science says, no, we should reinforce everywhere where there's no bullet holes, because those are the planes that aren't coming back. And so when we fail, what happens? Like, our failure is blameless. where is the line where failure is unacceptable? Because sometimes there is that mark that you could cross. Are problems looked at holistically? What does accountability look like? And when was the last bug or downtime? Like, what was the post-mortem look like for that thing? Talking about the sharing of ideas. So how frequently are ideas shared? How are ideas treated? Instantly shut down, or are they buried in a backlog somewhere? Are they actively being talked about? How are ideas showcased, and how are idea creators treated when sharing ideas? Team interaction. So how long till the first meaningful contribution? How are expectations managed, and by who? Do they have autonomy? How much of a vacuum is there? What is the state of the documentation or the resources for that team? And how long till the team becomes dependent on them? And then lastly, time, space, and resources. What is the percentage of time dedicated to intentional learning? What does this look like at different stages of your journey? How are you comfortable spending time? Are you comfortable spending time learning? I've met a lot of engineers and had talks with them where they've had goals to like learn, but they're doing it at home. We should have them have time and feel comfortable that if a thing goes out the sprint, that's fine. Does this comfort disappear over time? Is learning tied to remuneration? That's a very interesting question, and how could this affect the learning process? All right, so the last takeaway is make learning a part of the flow of work. It's not just beside it. Provide the smallest working group in your company with learning autonomy. Discover what the understanding gaps are within your organization. Reduce learning friction, which means simplify, clarify, standardize, and praise. And then lastly, the actual framework itself, which is define, set goals, measure, and ask lots of questions. All right, so that's that. I don't know how fast that was. I'm hoping it was okay. But yes, I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want to know anything about like how we're doing this. So far, we are implementing this. It's kind of in secret, so we have our engineering managers who have defined this, and they're looking for it. They're asking questions. We're gathering a lot of data. But we are finding that some teams are way more comfortable in learning than other teams, and it's becoming incredibly interesting for us to dissect this and eventually make this much better. It is an economic imperative, and I think we all want to make more money, right? Great, that's that. Thank you. All right, I don't see any questions on the channel, but if there's any questions this side. Cool. Yes. All right, very good question. Oh, there's a microphone there.
So how do you define your standards? Do you just do it at the team level in the smallest unit, or do you actually bubble that up?
Very good. So what we're busy doing now is setting that standard at a department level, so at the middle layer. And then each team can sort of have a little bit of leniency on that. So when we're talking about like the way that a team does its retros or its stand-ups, that's up to that team to figure out how they want to do those things. But us saying at an organization, at the department level, like that should be a standard. Like you need to be able to talk to each other, and it should be at least for like an hour for like a retro or something like that. Very good question. Thank you. Cool.
Hi. How are you going about making time available for learning within your company?
Very good questions. How are we making that available to the greater organization? So currently what we've done, we started off when I arrived, we started a new initiative called the Open Cycle, which means that you get an entire sprint or to work on the stuff that you want to work on. And we do that every quarter, or twice a year. So we did it twice last year, we've done it once this year so far. That's been like a big bang, like you spend your time learning, but it's more than just a hackathon. It's like really invest time in trying to do something interesting. And we haven't locked it to like coding. You can go do a course or read a book and then just present. You have to just present on what you learned. But then it's I would caution against tying this to remuneration. So don't, in your 360 reviews or at your annual performance review, say this person learned very well, so let's give him a lot of money, because then you take away what learning is supposed to be, and you'll find that people will do a whole bunch of courses and not actually do anything with that. So you want people to experiment with it. So the biggest and the most important thing that I would say that you could do for that is to tell every team to buffer time within every single story that they work on so that they can measure and that they can learn. So tell them, like, what would be an interesting metric to know that this feature that you've just built was a success? Like, what are the things that you would say? Like, oh, I would imagine that 4 times the number of people will get through this part. I'll share an example. We worked on a student application component of an application that I worked on a while ago, but we had to build it in multiple different languages. And what we discovered is that sometimes people were paid bi-weekly and sometimes people were paid monthly. And we first said it one way, like put in your monthly number, and like half of our user group would put in the right thing, and the other half would put in their like bi-weekly remuneration. So we're like, no, this is too crazy. So then we changed the UI again, and we did it the other way around. That changed literally nothing. Half of the people were putting in the wrong number again. So then we thought, like, maybe we do 2 different forms. So we say monthly in caps and bold, and the other one is like bi-weekly caps and bold. And if you fill in the one, the other one grays out. So we tried that. And what we learned was that like no one was spending time actually measuring and quickly learning on that feature. It was like every 6 months or so, we would get this thing, like a lot of people getting stuck at this part. So eventually what we did is, as people were typing it in, if it was like quite a low number, we would say, is this bi-weekly? And if they checked that, we would just multiply it in the back end by 12 to get the annual and store that. And doing those small iterative changes with that measuring and learning, eventually we had like only 10% of people get stuck at that phase, which was a massive reduction from like the 40. So yeah, it's really hard to do this because you're going to have to tell the product managers you're going to move from like an 8-pointer to like a 13-pointer, and they say, why? It's not that hard. And you're like, no, but we need to like put in stuff to measure this, and then we need to be able to learn from it and actually come back and try change things there. And I think is like the true spirit of like Agile and how we should be working there. Cool. Thank you very much. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can go on the DevConf website and you can tag there. And then there's also like devconf/rate. And if you want to get a vacuum cleaner, I'll also get a vacuum cleaner if you rate this talk really well. And we can joust. We can maybe make a cool video where we can have our vacuum cleaners go at each other. So that'll be quite fun. Anyways, thank you very much.